wasn't really silent, but we were not receiving prophetic teachings during a period of time. Okay? Sort of for us, a gap in there. Now, there may have been some left that's gone to perpetuity. We don't know. Okay, it's gone. Those things are gone. So I wanted to look at some of that tonight. So tonight we're going to talk about the King of Israel in reality. We did a little bit last week on in prophecy, and so we'll have a little prophecy tonight. All right, so I really like this particular chart. It's hard for you to read, easy for me. But we're going to go through it just a little bit, all right, because it does give you some insight into what's been going on, okay, before Jesus comes into the world. Because I really sometimes wonder, and I don't know, maybe you have too, why weren't the people more ready for Jesus as the Messiah as we see him in reality? Okay, they had this idea and this thing in mind, what they thought he was going to be like, and he was nothing really like that. I shouldn't say that. He was a warrior of a different type, wasn't he? He was a spiritual warrior, but he had little to nothing to do with physical fighting, right? He did overthrow a lot while he was here on the earth in a short amount of time, but very little of it was meant to be in any kind of warring manner. So I have this kind of blown up a little bit, but before we get into it, I guess I kind of should put this in the wrong place, but we know that Daniel interpreted a dream of Nebuchadnezzar, didn't we? And in that dream, there were nations that were identified, weren't there? Starting with his, right? His being the golden crown at the top. Now, you may not be able to see all of that, but I know you've studied this. We've studied this before about Nebuchadnezzar's dream and its interpretation of what it means. And we have seen it play out in reality, have we not, in history. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. So we have Babylon, the Persians. Kali talked about that, okay, on Sunday. The Persians, right? Cyrus. We sometimes talk a little bit about Greece, but we don't really have a lot about Greece in terms of the Greek of those overthrowing, if you will, the Medo-Persians in the Bible. We see this was done in a prophetic nature, but we do see it play out in the world, do we not? And then Rome. So when we pick up and we start talking about Jesus, we're talking about a time period in which they are in subjection to Rome, aren't we? And so that is the bottom part, if you will, of this statue that Nebuchadnezzar had seen in his dream, and Daniel had interpreted for him. And we're kind of down in a period of time where, the iron and clay are all kind of mixed together, and we see that that's not a very sturdy foundation to stand on, don't we? We know that. So let's look at a couple of these things here. So can you read this at all? Can you guys, any of you? Okay, so I'll read it to you. Okay, so the first line that I have drawn comes down to and drops into the Persian time period, okay? About around 536 to 330. Now, somewhere in there, this 400 years kind of begins, okay? And so we see Cyrus then taking over. We see some of the Israelites coming back, if you will, to Judah, if you will, and rebuilding the temple, rebuilding Jerusalem, and so on, and that happening, during this Persian time. Then we talk about this Alexandrian. Who are we talking about when we talk about the Alexandrian Empire or the Greek Empire? Who are we talking about? Okay, Alexander the Great, he's well documented in history. We know who he is. We know what he did. He died very young, but accomplished a lot. Right? He moved quickly, fast, didn't he, across the world, and took places that militarily they thought were impossible to be taken. Okay? But he, through more, I think, through his insistence of doing it than maybe such a great, if you will, mind, But he did have a great military mind, put that together, and he moved very swiftly across the world of that time. Okay, then the next one we see the Judea being ruled by Egypt, and we talked a little bit about the rub that began, didn't we, on Sunday, in that we know that Judah began to fight against Egypt because Egypt began to make arrangements with Assyria, and Israel was right in the middle, right, of that. Okay. Then we have the Syrian rule, which was a very strong empire at the time. Now, you may not have ever heard of the Maccabean revolt, okay, but the Maccabee was a family, wasn't it, at that time? And they revolted, if you will, against their Syrians and others that had been trying to rule them of this time. So we see, even though we don't have new prophets, if you will, coming into that period of time and prophesying, we have a lot of events occurring. Events playing out that had already been prophesied about. Right? So these are just being, if you will, carried out. Then we come to Rome, right? Roman rule of the time. And that kind of took some different paths, if you will. I think the next one I have is listed here. Now, this is a chart I did not make, all right, so I'm just trying to utilize it. But then they call out Caesar because Rome became a republic, okay, and we know that even some of ours, not all of them, but some of our own government is kind of patterned a little bit after the Roman Republic, if you will. Now, what is the idea of a republic? You're ruled by laws, right? By laws. And you would have someone they had the what we would consider to be Congress, if you will. They had senators. They even used in there the term senator, okay, for them at the time. And then we also know that during Jesus' time, Herod the Great was in existence. Then we know he had a great influence over, really over the Jews and Jesus' family. Right? And we'll see a couple of things tonight if we can get to that. Okay. All right. The next little thing I wanted to talk about was another chart you can't read. But it's what goes on kind of started happening, because I don't know if you ever wondered, but I have wondered, because the Bible doesn't necessarily point some of these things out. Where did synagogues come from? Okay. And it's kind of obvious that some of these things came up out of a matter of convenience, because what happens in AD 70? Well, what happens when Nebuchadnezzar comes in his final trip to Judah? He destroys the temple, doesn't he, at that time? And then they have to rebuild it, okay, after that. And eventually they're going to be having to find another way to worship. And we'll talk about that some. All right, I just want to run down this real quick, and then we'll get into a little more, I think, germane to what we want to talk about tonight. at that time, they were very focused during that time period on the first five books, right? And that becomes really their adopted law with some other writings. Eventually, the Jews have some rabbis that they hold in high esteem that write some material that they begin to kind of add to, if you will, the law. Some new groups come up. We read about the scribes, Pharisees, and the Sadducees in the New Testament, don't we? We'll talk a little bit about the Essenes tonight. They also then come out in the New Testament times. There's a Greek translation of the scriptures. I think the class here is studying Koine Greek. Okay, it became the language of the world really at the time, especially business, but also in matter of discourse. It was a common language, if you will, that was spoken, and that helped the Bible. It helped the word, if you will, get spread. This quest for knowledge is kind of tied to the Greeks. Greeks want, they just lived for what happens in Athens, some new thing, right? Searching for some new thing to be spoken about. Yeah, okay, here's the universal Greek language talked about. But then also we see in the New Testament persecution, dispersion, this idea of Roman roads. There, I was just reading today about a couple of places in England that still today there are two roads that are used, and they were developed by Rome. Okay, and they're still in use there today. And there's some other ones. You can see the Appian Way in Rome and things like that, which was made by them, and we really copied their method for that, making roads. The world did, because it was so well done and preserved for us. Now, so one of the things that I was wondering about, and maybe you have wondered too, why was Israel looking for a military leader when most of what you see written about Jesus in terms of prophecy, the Messiah, that's not really what's talked about or focused on. However, there are some words used that confused them, probably. And because what were the kings about? They went to war, didn't they? A phrase is always kind of stuck in my mind about David. When David got in trouble with Bathsheba, it's stated he stayed home at the time when kings went out to war. Okay? So there was a time that kings went out to war during the year, and he stayed home and got himself in bad trouble. But there's some writings. Have you heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls? I'm sure most all of us have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I have not. I've seen a couple of things in both the museum in Chicago and a couple things in the British Museum. But the Essene was a sect that had kind of kept themselves, if you will, pulled themselves out of the world, and they wrote some things, and they kind of made themselves the protectors of documents and that sort of thing from that time, especially about the Bible and about really the law. And so they had two basic ways of talking about the Messiah. Okay, two separate, if you will, figures or ideas. What do you think those were? What's one of them? He's gonna do what? Throw off Rome, right? He's a military guy. And what would be the other one? Well, he's a servant. Okay? So both of those ideas, he's a servant or he's a conquering king, was part of what they represented the Messiah as. And it's difficult, it was difficult for them to get their head around the fact that Jesus was going to come as a biblical use of the term meek, okay, and a servant. Okay? That he would value service or being a servant more than he would value beating Rome. Okay? And for Acts, first chapter and verse 6, even Peter, what's he say? He says, "Are you now going to restore the kingdom?" Right? That's what Peter says to Jesus. So all of them had basically fell to that place when they thought about the Messiah. So they were still expecting Jesus to come and restore political power, physical power, throw off everyone, kick everyone out of Canaan again, take over, if you will, and elevate Israel to the level that it had previously been. And there's still people to this day today who think that's going to happen. Now, much of the Jewish religion is based on that. But also we have people in our own Congress who are what has been typified as a Zionist. Well, what does that mean? What is a Zionist? Well, Zionists think Jesus is going to come back and he's going to set up a physical throne in Jerusalem and reign there for 1,000 years. Okay? That's kind of, in a nutshell, what that is, what a Zionist is. And there we have congressmen, whether they believe it or they don't want to be caught not believing it if it's true, if you know what I mean. Okay? Typical sort of political thing. The New Testament reveals that the expectation, the apostles and the common Jews, was that he was going to be a conquering son of David, just like cut from the same cloth, if you will, as David. And David is referred to as a man after God's own heart, but he was not allowed to build the house for God, was he? Where God was going to dwell, because of his warring nature. And what did God do? He made peace so that Solomon could build it because it was peaceful at that time. And then, of course, we just talked about Peter. Still, him being confused also about what was going to happen. So here's Israel's predicament, okay? They are captives to the Roman Empire, and they hated it. They hated that. They had a history, right? Israel's history is that of oppression, exile. They had fought and had victory over these various enemies that had been in the land of Canaan and who oppressed them from the side. And it had been that way from the beginning of them entering into the promised land. It seems the Old Testament contains over 300 prophecies, which is why I'm not going through all the prophecies tonight, but we'll hit a couple of them. But the Old Testament contains over 300 prophecies about this future Messiah, this deliverer. And he was going to be a savior anointed by God, and therein also is a difficulty. Because when you use those words together, okay, anointed by God, they were used to that being done for kings and for prophets, weren't they? And so sometimes their mind would arc to that as the definition, if you will, of the Messiah, or what the Messiah was going to be like. We're still in this idea of why were they looking for a military leader? And so, when Jesus' time came, and I hadn't really thought of this in these words, really, but by this time, Israel's been through a lot, the area of it that Israel lived in. And that area there was not considered in really high standing, if you will, both in the world and in Rome. And it was a difficult place to live, make a living, etc. The heyday, if you will, was gone, was in the past. And so now, Rome loved them for two reasons, food and money. They loved taxes, so they were great about that. They loved taxes. They kind of viewed the Jews as kind of troublemakers. Okay? The word cantankerous is an old-timey word, but that's what that means. Someone that's kind of a troublemaker, right? And so that's the Jews that Jesus is being born into. Okay, this is a time period. The Jews had very little autonomy, if any, but they did focus and really modify the laws, okay, through traditions. And so they kind of had, while they were focused on religion, it was what they had made it to be. Yes, they still went through some of the festivals and things like that, but they had a lot of customs and a lot of traditions that they had added to this at the time. Now, I forgot, Derek, will you read those verses for me?
Jeremiah 23, 5 and 6. Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, that I will raise to David a branch of righteousness. The king shall reign and prosper and execute judgment and righteousness in the earth. In his days, Judah will be saved, and Israel will dwell safely. Now this is the name by which he will be called, the Lord our righteousness.
Okay, so they had these words, right? They had these prophecies available to them. But they really didn't know how to interpret them well. But this is part of what we were talking about on Sunday. And no, this was I'm getting it mixed now. Last Wednesday, I think it was the stump with the branch, okay? So that's what we're talking about here, all right? That the Lord will raise up for David a righteous branch, right? A branch. And it's going to come down to that. At least 2 times, Jesus' lineage comes down to one person, one person breaking his lineage. In other words, one person if that person had died or didn't accomplish what they were going to accomplish, his lineage would have been broken. That's how close that it came to that happening. And however, I think that, the problem that we see is the Jews, failed to notice, read carefully, the messianic prophecies, which presented the Messiah in a light that they did not like. Okay? They wanted this person to be a warring king. Now, I'm not recommending this. Okay? I'm just telling you, there is a show on called The Chosen. I don't know if anyone here has seen any of that. But there's several things in there I don't like. Some things I find to be okay in some of it. But it's hard for us, we're sitting here, we're talking about these things. It's hard for us to see their confusion when we can read these verses ourselves. But one thing I got from that show is they're all confused. Okay? They did not understand at all what was going on. And Jesus was not very specific. Now, he was telling them things, but not in their words, not in a way for them to know. He was telling them, I'm going, I'm gone. I'm not going to be here for you. But they just didn't hear that. They thought he's going to be a warring king. So let's look at a couple of other things here then. So the Jews of Jesus' day expected a victorious, conquering Messiah. Someone that was going to come in and annihilate all of their enemies, right? And so they wanted a great general who would overthrow the Roman invaders. They wanted someone to come in and to free the promised land of all these pagan occupation forces. Compare the Israel that we know of, the Judah that we know of with Jesus' time. Compare it to David's. Okay? Compare it to Solomon's. There was so much wealth during Solomon's time. I think they thought it would last literally forever. And so did the world at the time. Okay? They were in awe of Israel. And this is where now we find them as they are now, basically slaves to Rome. And they thought that he would install the Jews as supreme rulers of the world again. The whole world. That's what they had in their mind. All right, so that's what they thought. Okay, so it was interesting to me. I wanted to see why were they thinking the way they were, because the Bible doesn't really represent him that way, And so, but how does the Bible represent him? And so let's look at a couple of things there. So what was David's style of leading? He was a shepherd, wasn't he? Now, he was a warrior king, and he did accomplish great military feats and battles. But when he defeated Goliath, he was just a young, ruddy boy that kept sheep and played a lyre, right? And that image, if you will, keep that image in your mind, that is the image of how I think God wanted him to live. It was like that person. And when you look at here in Matthew 5, verses 5, 6, now this is from actually cited. Isn't it great to have all of this synergy and right at our fingertips here? Because Micah 5:2 is really what Matthew is writing from here. It says, they told him in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. And that's what Jesus came here to be, was that shepherd, to lead the people of Israel of the time. This idea of Jesus coming as the son of David was misapplied by the people of the time. Because in the way of being the son of David was the shepherd king. That's the part that was supposed to come forward from David to them. And they didn't get that. So how did Jesus come? He first came accomplishing God's work, didn't he? That's what he went about doing. He came, and he did so perfectly. Then he exhorts us lovingly, tenderly, compassionately to follow him. And let's look at how Peter describes this, okay? For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you. when Jesus came into the world, there was another direction he could have gone. He could have tossed Rome out. He could have set Israel up as the nation of the world of the time. But instead we see him coming suffering, right? And so we see someone that comes more lowly and suffering for us. And he leaves us that example. That is what we are to be like. Okay? The same approach. He wants us to follow in his steps. So he was the shepherd. He was to be the shepherd king. He wants us to follow in those steps. He committed no sin. I mean, that alone, does it not so far exceed any military win? Being able to live in this world sin-free, as he did, to be, once again, to be an example like us. Neither was deceit found in his mouth. He did not come lying or tricking us, did he? And we often find that today, those who have the most, and we kind of lean toward people with charisma, don't we? We seem to be drawn to them. We want to be around them. We want to be associated with them. It was his life that drew the people to him. Not the charisma that we see today, the fake charisma that happens today. When he was reviled, okay, so when they beat him, when they called him names, when they ignored him, when they wouldn't obey him, okay, he didn't revile in return. When he suffered, he didn't threaten them because he was suffering at their hands. But then it says, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. And is that not what we are to be doing today, right? So are we not to entrust ourselves to the only judge that will judge us justly? I think we know that's true. He bore our sins in his body on a tree. Isn't this a great set of verses here? I mean, it kind of gives us his whole life and his whole psyche, doesn't it? And he did this that we might die to sin. Not die to sin by hanging on the tree. He hung on the tree. But he paid for our sin. And we are to live righteous. And by his wounds, we have been healed. His suffering, both physically and mentally, is what heals us and keeps us from having to suffer physically and mentally. And then kind of returning back to this idea of sheep, it says, for you were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. That's the Jesus that they were supposed to recognize. That's the Messiah that they were supposed to see, but they did not see that part, did they? They were mad because they wanted him to come and throw off Rome, but that's not what he came to fight. He came to fight sin. He didn't come to fight Rome. Okay, so let's compare that now a little bit. Now, think back over the past 3 months, and let's talk a little bit about what were those kings like. I kind of did a quick count here, and just in the 2 columns here. So in Judah seemed to have 5 fairly good, not always 100%, but fairly good. Let's say the needle's really close to good, okay? We had 11 of them that were evil, and the needle was fairly solid in the evil side. And then we had them that kind of started good and failed, or failed at first and started and ended good. Okay, so they were good and evil. I don't know where that ends up exactly. And then in Israel, we had really 18 evil. And the one that's good evil is, it's hard to call him good, okay? Because he was put in place to kill Ahab. I mean, but he did that, okay? God put him there to do that, and he did that. And so in that sense, he was good. But let's look for a minute about the characteristics that we saw in these kings. Deceit. Okay. You saw deceit, lying. When you see that word, think lying. When we see lying, think deceit. We saw that a lot, didn't we, in these kings? We saw murder. Right? Innocent people. As a matter of fact, Manasseh killed so many people that even though he ended good, he's pointed at as the reason that God overthrew Israel, overthrew Judah, let them go ahead and go into bondage. He'd killed so many innocent people, so much innocent blood had flown. Infanticide, the killing of children. Idol worship, all over the place, right? I mean, even those who got rid of the idols to Baal and others, what's the one thing that was always said? Didn't get rid of the high places. Disobedience. We see them directly disobeying God. We see some obeying. I'll give them that. Some obeyed God. Most, all of them, ended up falling to the idol of pride. Right? Patricide, the elimination of family, right? Genocide, the elimination of a whole tribe. Greed. There were some reformers, right? Josiah, his name comes to mind, right? Immediately. Lying about what they've done, lying to God, lying to the prophets, right? And so that's quite a difference, isn't it, between the verses that we read of the person of Jesus that came into this world as the shepherd. Okay, for a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. There's no doubt that Isaiah ultimately spoke of Jesus in these verses. We don't see this exact set of verses in the New Testament, but you see part of them. Isaiah 9, 1 and 2 is quoted in Matthew, etc. Okay, things like that. But the idea here is what the names that were given to Jesus and what they represented. Right? And we could talk about these some more, but I wanted to get into a couple other thoughts. We got 2 minutes left, I think. So a close examination of David and Solomon, who were considered and are considered to be the apex, right? The pinnacle, right? The top, if you will, of the kingdom in Israel, reveals just how far from the kingdom of God these two are. Okay. The temple was built, peace was established in David's time, and continues on. An astonishing level of wealth. I mean, go back and reread the wealth of Solomon's time. It's absolutely amazing, the wealth that was given to them, which all became really naught because of his unwillingness to stay the course. But all was not right. Okay, so these things were going great for Solomon. But the transition from judges to this monarchy brought a lot of problems with it, didn't it? We see royal abuse starting right away almost with David, right? David and Bathsheba. We see idolatries, immorality, its corrupt worship, even human sacrifice. David's kingdom had to go away as it had existed, and a new kingdom had to come in its place. I'm going to go through this in one last statement. So the prophets of the time, they provided the people with hope, but they did it in a way by retaining terminology of the old, but they put some new meanings to it, right? And that's how they came up with the idea of, Jesus being a warrior God. They spoke of Zion, okay? They spoke of Israel. They spoke of David. They spoke of military victory, economic prosperity. And they embedded in these prophets messages of doom. The prophets were messages from these prophets were messages of doom. But in them, they was also the good news of the kingdom. The world as they knew it was going to end and a new kingdom was going to come. David's line may have been reduced to a stump, but it was just enough life left to give future generations hope of the time. I'm going to skip down. I see he's headed to the... All right, so Jesus reigns as king. Daniel had a vision in which he saw the Son of Man coming in the clouds, with the clouds of heaven. This, as later he interprets that as, that's Jesus. He comes to the Ancient of Days, that's God, and he brought him near him. Then he was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, languages should serve him. We'll have to stop there. Next week, I believe, is going to be a singing, right? And so I think I have just a few more slides here, but I'm going to stop here and just make a couple of comments, and then I'll end. We see when Jesus leaves Jesus' kingdom, if you will, and Daniel 2:44 says it's going to be a kingdom that never can be destroyed. It's still a kingdom that exists today with us today. Okay? And you don't destroy a spiritual kingdom. But what did Jesus say in his own words in John 18? Let's see if I can get us down to that real quick here. So Pilate asks him about being a king, and what does Jesus say? My kingdom is not of this world. Okay? I'm a king, but I'm not a king that you need to be worried about in this world. Okay? And that's the king that we worship today. Thank you.